Imagine a country where the military is literally constitutionally obligated to overthrow the government if it becomes too religious.
Right, which is just a wild concept to start with.
It really is. Now imagine that very same military accidentally paving the way for the most powerful, culturally transformative religious uprising in the nation's entire history.
Yeah, that's the ultimate paradox of modern Turkey.
Exactly. I mean, you've probably been told that secularism there was strictly enforced by the sword of the military, but what if the very army that was meant to protect the nation's foundational vision actually, well, through the mechanics of democracy itself, dismantled its own power?
And that's exactly what we're looking at today. It is a stunning historical irony, really.
Yeah, so today we're diving into how a century of forced modernization may have inadvertently created the exact religious resurgence it was explicitly designed to prevent.
Because when you look at the broad sweep of the 20th and 21st centuries, there are, very few geopolitical transformations as complex or as fiercely debated as this one.
Which is why this is our mission for today's deep dive. We are jumping into this absolutely fascinating stack of notes, research, and excerpts from a document titled Ataturk's Secular Ghost: The Battle for the Turkish Soul.
It's a great piece of research.
It is. It's incredible. We're going to trace the anatomy of this national identity crisis. But right out of the gate, we should probably set the table regarding how we're approaching this material.
Yeah, we definitely need some ground rules here.
Right, because this is the kind of topic that, starts heated arguments at dinner tables across the globe. It touches on these fundamental tensions between secular urban elites and deeply religious heartlands.
Which is precisely why our approach today has to be strictly observational.
Strictly observational.
Yeah, we're leaving our own politics at the door for this one. We aren't here to champion the secular, Western-facing vision of the Republic's founders, and we certainly aren't here to endorse the religious, populist vision of the current establishment either.
Right, no taking sides.
Exactly. The goal is to just, look under the hood of these sources and impartially figure out the mechanics. We want to map out the why and the how behind these massive societal shifts.
So that you, listening, can fully grasp the stakes of what is arguably the most intense cultural tug-of-war in modern geopolitics.
Couldn't have said it better.
All right, let's get right into the mechanics then. Because to really understand the 2026 landscape that this document focuses on, we have to start with the architect.
We have to go back to the 1920s.
Right, back to Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. When you read the source material detailing the sheer speed and, the scale of what he accomplished in those early years, it actually defies basic political gravity.
It really does. It's almost unimaginable by today's standards.
Yeah, we aren't just talking about a change in government here. We are talking about a total aggressive overhaul of a nation's foundational DNA.
You really have to remember the context of the time. The Ottoman Empire had just collapsed after centuries of dominance.
Right, end of World War I.
Exactly. The empire was partitioned, and the country was facing existential ruin. It was a crisis on every level.
And Ataturk didn't just want to reform those crumbling structures, right?
No, not at all. He believed that for a new Turkish nation to survive and actually compete in the modern world, he had to perform a massive cultural amputation.
A cultural amputation. That's a strong phrase.
But that's what it was.
Yeah.
He believed the only viable path forward was an absolute force-multiplied westernization. And, he started by targeting the very top of the societal pyramid. In 1924, he just abolishes the caliphate.
Okay, I want to pause right there. Because I feel like the modern Western ear hears abolishing the caliphate and kind of equates it to, dissolving a monarchy or just changing a prime minister.
Right, like an administrative shift.
Yeah, but that completely understates the gravity of the move, doesn't it? For centuries, the caliphate was the supreme religious and political authority of the global Islamic world.
It was the absolute anchor of their universe.
Yeah.
It was the bedrock of their societal and spiritual organization. The Sultan of the Ottoman Empire wasn't just a king, he was the caliph.
The successor to the Prophet Muhammad.
Exactly, the leader of the global faithful. And Ataturk simply dissolves that office entirely, just wipes it out.
Which is wild.
He strips it of all power and literally sends the royal family into exile. But, the abolition of the caliphate was really just the opening salvo.
Just the beginning.
Yeah. He immediately moves to dismantle the entire legal framework of the society. He completely abolishes Islamic law, Sharia, which had governed everyday life, marriage, inheritance, and commerce for hundreds of years.
And what he replaces it with is just staggering to me. The notes detail how he essentially imported a new legal system wholesale.
Wholesale, literally.
He brings in the Swiss Civil Code, the Italian Penal Code, the German Commercial Code. I mean, he literally took European laws, translated them into Turkish, and dropped them directly onto a Middle Eastern, deeply Islamic society.
The audacity of that move is incredible, honestly. Think about the friction that creates at the local level.
Oh, it must have been chaos.
You have rural Anatolian villages
Yeah.
where disputes have been settled by local Islamic scholars for generations, right? And suddenly, overnight, the magistrate is referencing translated Swiss property laws.
That's just bizarre to think about.
The legal framework of the nation was completely detached from the cultural and religious history of the actual people living in it.
It's like forcing a mandatory overnight operating system update on an entire culture's collective brain.
Oh, that's a perfect analogy.
You know, you go to sleep running a software you've used for 600 years, a software that organizes your entire view of the world, and you wake up the next morning and the central government says, surprise.
Surprise, new software.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We are now running a completely foreign operating system. It operates on entirely different logic. Oh, by the way, you don't even know how to use the interface.
The operating system analogy is highly accurate, really, because this wasn't just a high-level bureaucratic shift. Ataturk recognized that changing the laws in parliament wasn't enough to change the mind of the populace.
Right, you have to change how they live.
Exactly. He had to inject this new operating system directly into the mundane, everyday, physical lives of the citizens. And this is where the source text highlights two incredibly profound examples of this psychological shock.
The Hat Law and the Alphabet Reform.
Yes, the Hat Law of 1925 and the Alphabet Reform of 1928.
Okay, the Hat Law is the one that really trips me up. Because from the outside, it sounds almost comical, you know?
It does sound strange to us now.
Ataturk bans the fez. He makes traditional religiously significant headwear illegal. And he decrees that if you want to be a citizen of this modern republic, you have to wear Western-style hats with brims.
Fedoras, bowler hats, Panamas.
Well, right. And you just have to ask, why risk a massive societal revolt over haberdashery? I mean, why hats?
Well, to understand the mechanism here, you have to look at the physicality of Islamic prayer. The brim of the hat is the entire point.
Wait, really? The brim?
Yes, the brim. In traditional Islamic prayer, you must perform the sujood. That's the prostration where your forehead physically touches the ground in submission to God.
Okay, I'm tracking.
If you are wearing a brimmed hat, like a fedora, that physical act becomes mechanically impossible without actually taking the hat off.
Oh, wow, yeah.
The fez, which is brimless, allowed for uninterrupted prayer.
So, by forcing men into Western hats, the state is physically interrupting the mechanics of daily religious practice.
Exactly that.
They are placing a literal barrier between the citizen and the ground.
It was a highly calculated intrusion into personal piety. The state was signaling very aggressively that the visual and physical markers of the modern, secular citizen must supersede the traditional markers of the religious subject.
And they were serious about it, right?
Deadly serious. If you resisted, the punishments were severe.
Yeah.
There were these things called independence tribunals set up that actually executed people for protesting the hat law.
Executed over a hat.
Yeah.
Which proves this wasn't about fashion at all.
Not at all.
It was about absolute submission to the new secular order. But as invasive as criminalizing a culture's wardrobe is, the text points to the alphabet reform as an even deeper trauma.
Oh, undoubtedly.
In 1928, Ataturk scraps the Arabic script, which the Ottoman Empire had used for centuries, and replaces it with a modified Western Latin alphabet.
The rationale provided at the time was functional, right?
Yeah.
Arabic script is incredibly difficult to read and write for the Turkish language, and literacy rates in the Ottoman Empire were dismally low.
Okay, so there's a practical argument.
Yeah, Ataturk argued that a phonetic Latin alphabet would rapidly increase literacy, which, to be fair, it eventually did. And he argued it would pull the country culturally and economically closer to Europe.
But the immediate mechanism of that change, the undeniable result, was a total cultural severance.
It's a complete break.
I'm just trying to put myself in the shoes of someone living through that. Overnight, you are made illiterate in your own historical archives.
Overnight.
You can no longer read the gravestones of your parents or grandparents. You can no longer read the original texts of your religion, the poetry of your ancestors, or the history of your empire. You are just completely cut off.
It is a surgical amputation from the past. By changing the alphabet, Ataturk effectively locked the entire history of the Ottoman Empire behind an impenetrable linguistic wall.
Wow.
The next generation of Turks would grow up completely unable to read the documents of their own heritage. The umbilical cord to the Islamic imperial past was cut.
Ensuring that the only direction the society could conceivably look was forward, toward the secular West.
Exactly. He forced them to face West.
But wait, I have to push back on the viability of this strategy, because you can't just inflict that level of psychological shock, taking away the caliphate, criminalizing their clothes, erasing their alphabet, and expect everyone to just, nod and agree.
Oh, people definitely didn't just agree.
Right. You are going into the traditional Anatolian heartland and essentially telling millions of people that their entire way of life is backward, illegal, and abolished. Doesn't that practically guarantee a massive, violent backlash?
It doesn't just guarantee a backlash, it forces that backlash underground to simmer. And Ataturk, being a brilliant military strategist, understood this perfectly.
He knew they would resist.
Of course. He knew that people don't just willingly surrender their core identity because a man in the capital signed a piece of paper. He knew the resistance would be immense, and that is why he installed the ultimate constitutional failsafe.
The Iron Guardians.
Precisely. To protect this aggressive top-down secularization project, the Turkish military was assigned a very specific constitutionally elevated role.
They weren't just a normal army.
Right. They were not designed to merely be a conventional army that protects the borders from foreign invaders. Under their internal service laws, they were explicitly codified as the guardians of the Turkish Republic and its secular foundation against internal threats.
Meaning, they were the armed protectors against their own citizens.
Yes.
So if the public ever voted for a party that wanted to bring back Islamic law or the caliphate, the military had a legal mandate to turn their guns inward and stop it.
The military became the permanent firewall against religious resurgence. And they exercised this power ruthlessly over the years.
They didn't just sit on their hands.
Not at all. For decades, the generals operated as the ultimate veto power over the democratic will of the people. If a conservative, religiously leaning political party gained too much traction, or if the prime minister started talking too openly about Islamic values, the military would simply step in.
And we saw this happen a lot, right?
Repeatedly. There were full-blown military coups in 1960 and 1980. We saw a memorandum coup in 1971 where the military forced the government to resign just by sending a threatening letter.
A letter. That's how much power they had.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And even as recently as 1997, they executed what's often called a postmodern coup.
A postmodern coup.
Yeah, where they essentially rolled a few tanks down the street and pressured a religiously conservative prime minister out of office without firing a single shot.
So democracy in Turkey only existed within the strict parameters set by the generals. You can vote for whoever you wanted as long as the generals approved of them.
That was the reality for the better part of 80 years. The secular ghost of Ataturk was kept alive by the very real, very heavily armed threat of the military command.
Okay, but this brings us to the massive structural tension that drives the rest of the source material. We've established that the military was the ultimate impenetrable firewall.
Right.
But looking at the political landscape of the last 20 years, well, the firewall completely collapsed. The deeply religious establishment currently in power seems to have completely neutralized the generals. How on earth did they dismantle the Iron Guardians?
The mechanics of how this happened represent one of the most masterful political maneuvers of the 21st century, because it wasn't a sudden, violent overthrow of the military apparatus.
It wasn't a civil war.
No, the new political establishment didn't defeat the generals in a war. They defeated them using the mechanisms, the language, and the bureaucratic tools of Western democracy.
The source material refers to this as bureaucratic strangulation. And this is where the European Union comes into play, right? Because the timeline here is really crucial.
The timeline is everything. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Turkey was desperately trying to join the European Union.
Right, for the economic benefits.
Exactly. The economic benefits would have been astronomical. But the EU laid out strict conditions, known as the Copenhagen criteria, for any nation wanting to join.
And the military was a problem there.
A huge problem. One of the absolute non-negotiable red lines for Brussels was that a modern European democracy cannot have a military that dictates civilian politics.
Because it violates the core premise of democratic civilian oversight.
Right. The EU told Ankara, essentially, if you want access to our markets, you have to get your generals out of your parliament and out of your courts.
Okay, so here's the twist.
Here is the twist. A new wave of highly strategic, religiously conservative politicians looked at that EU mandate and realized it was the perfect weapon.
Wow. They used the EU against the military.
Yes. They formed a new political movement that represented that marginalized religious heartland, and they campaigned aggressively on a platform of EU integration and rapid democratic reform.
So they are presenting themselves to the world as progressive Democrats. They are going to Brussels and saying, we agree with you. The military has too much power. Help us reform our laws to meet your standards.
It's brilliant, really.
Yeah.
They adopted the language of human rights and Western liberalism to achieve their own internal goals. And year by year, reform package by reform package, they systematically stripped the military of its institutional armor.
How did they do that specifically? Like what laws?
Well, they passed laws that removed military generals from the National Security Council, which had previously been their primary tool for dictating domestic policy.
Okay, taking away their policy voice.
Then they revoked the military's immunity from civilian prosecution, meaning generals could now be arrested and put on trial by civilian courts. And they slashed the military budget's lack of transparency.
So they systematically defanged them. And what could the military do? If they executed a coup to stop the reforms, they would instantly destroy Turkey's chances of joining the EU.
Which would crash the economy and turn the entire population against them.
Man, the politicians trapped the generals in a complete geopolitical catch-22.
It was brilliant political jujitsu. The military's power was neutralized by the very Western democratic ideals they originally claimed to be protecting.
That is just wild.
But the text makes it clear that dismantling the military was really only half the battle. To truly secure power and fundamentally shift the nation's identity, the new establishment had to deal with the high judiciary.
Right, because power doesn't just evaporate. If it's removed from the generals, it has to be transferred somewhere else. And the courts were the other half of the secular establishment.
Exactly. The constitutional courts and the high judiciary were historically stacked with the secular urban elite. If the military was the sword of Ataturk's legacy, the courts were the shield.
They could ban parties, couldn't they?
Yes, they had the power to literally ban political parties for violating the secular principles of the Constitution. And they had banned numerous conservative parties in the past.
So I'm curious about the mechanism here. You can't just pass a law to fire the entire Supreme Court, can you? I mean, how did they flesh out the old guard?
Through a series of highly contested, incredibly complex constitutional referendums, the government took their case directly to the public.
Oh, so they put it to a vote.
Right. They argued that the judiciary was an elitist, undemocratic institution holding the country back from true representation. And through these referendums, they altered the way judges were appointed.
Shifting the balance of power.
They expanded the number of seats on the high courts and effectively packed the judiciary with magistrates who were sympathetic to the religious heartland. They even lowered retirement ages to force the old guard out and brought in their own people.
So the secular establishment loses its sword and its shield. The military is confined to their barracks, and the courts are fundamentally restructured.
Complete restructure.
Which leads directly to a concept in the text that absolutely fascinated me. The failed guardrail paradox.
Oh, this is a devastating critique of traditional Western political science.
Let's unpack it, because I really want to challenge the foundational logic of it. In any Policy 101 class, you are taught that weakening a military's grip on politics is inherently a positive progression.
Always. That's the standard assumption.
Right. You remove the authoritarian guardrails, you expand voting rights, you establish civilian oversight, and the result is supposed to be a stronger, more liberal, more Western-style democracy.
The people get to decide, not guys with medals on their chests.
Exactly. But the source argues that by following this exact democratic playbook, Turkey achieved the exact opposite outcome.
It achieved a deeply illiberal outcome, at least from the perspective of the secular founders.
Right. So how does expanding democratic freedom, doing exactly what the EU told them to do, lead directly to a populist religious revolution? It seems completely counterintuitive to everything we assume about democratization.
The misunderstanding really stems from a critical blind spot that Western observers had regarding the composition of the Turkish electorate.
A blind spot.
Yeah. The assumption in Brussels and Washington was that if you remove the artificial ceiling placed on society by the military, you will naturally uncover a population of secular, liberal, European-minded citizens eager to embrace Western values.
They thought underneath the military was just a bunch of Parisians waiting to get out.
That's exactly what they thought, but they ignored the demographic reality of the country. The reality was that the vast majority of the population, living in the massive Anatolian heartland, had never truly internalized Ataturk's forced operating system update for the 1920s.
Oh, wow. So they never actually updated.
Never. They'd never stopped wanting to wear their traditional clothes. They'd never stopped valuing Islamic law over Swiss civil codes, and they had never abandoned their piety.
They weren't converted. They were just suppressed. They were enduring the secularism because they literally had guns pointed at them.
The trauma of the hat law and the alphabet reform hadn't disappeared. It had just been driven into the private sphere for decades.
That makes so much sense.
So when you actually expand democratic freedom, when you truly institute one person, one vote, and you completely remove the military threat that used to invalidate those votes, well, the conservative majority finally gets to express its true cultural and political preferences.
Wow. So the failed guardrail paradox is that by fully democratizing the system, the secular elite accidentally handed the keys to the kingdom to the very people they had spent 80 years trying to politically marginalize.
When you remove the guardrail, the car goes where the terrain dictates, and the terrain of Turkey is deeply, historically conservative.
That is a phenomenal way to put it.
But we have to be careful here, because it's too simplistic to say that this shift was purely about poor rural farmers finally getting to vote. That doesn't explain the sheer power and permanence of this new establishment.
Because nature and politics abhors a vacuum. When the generals dropped the steering wheel, it wasn't just grabbed by a random citizen.
No, it was seized by a highly organized, newly empowered force.
Which brings us to the economic engine behind this entire cultural earthquake. The text calls this phenomenon the rise of the Anatolian tiger.
This is perhaps the most crucial piece of the puzzle, the economics of piety.
The economics of piety.
You cannot understand the cultural shift without understanding the massive transfer of wealth that preceded it. In the 1980s, and especially the 1990s, Turkey began aggressively opening up its economy.
Embracing free markets.
Yes, they moved away from strict state-controlled industries and embraced global free market capitalism.
Up until this point, the wealth of the country was almost entirely concentrated in the hands of the secular elite in Istanbul, right? The old money, the industrial barons who had close ties to the state and the military.
Yes, the Istanbul bourgeoisie. But the economic liberalization allowed a completely new class of entrepreneurs to emerge. Suddenly, you had these medium-sized cities deep in the conservative heartland cities like Kayseri, Konya, and Gaziantep that experienced an explosive industrial boom.
Like manufacturing powerhouses.
They became manufacturing powerhouses seemingly overnight. They were producing textiles, furniture, machinery, auto parts, and exporting them globally.
And the businessmen running these new factories, the ones generating all this unprecedented export wealth, were the Anatolian tigers.
They were. And what made them unique is the specific sociological blend they embodied. The text compares them to the early European capitalists, noting they possessed the fierce work ethic and frugality of the Calvinists, but their moral and social framework was deeply rooted in conservative Sunni Islam.
Okay, just to clarify that Calvinist comparison for the listener, we're talking about that classic sociological concept where diligent, disciplined, hard work, and the accumulation of capital are seen almost as a spiritual duty, right? You don't flash your wealth, you reinvest it into the business and the community.
That is precisely the dynamic. They were building massive, globally competitive enterprises, but they were doing it while pausing production for daily prayers.
Pausing the assembly line to pray.
Yes, they built mosques right on the factory floors. They were devoutly religious, but fiercely capitalist. They were generating massive revenue, creating thousands of jobs, and building immense regional wealth.
And as any historian will tell you, when a marginalized group suddenly acquires massive economic power, it inevitably leads to political demands.
You don't build a multi-million-dollar export business and then quietly accept being treated as a second-class citizen by the state.
No, you don't. This new prosperity fueled an undeniable demand for cultural representation. The religious middle class, who now held significant purse strings and employed a large portion of the population, looked at the secular state apparatus and basically said, why doesn't this country reflect our values?
And I can imagine the friction points were everywhere. The source material specifically mentions the headscarf bans in universities.
That was the ultimate flashpoint. For decades under the secular guardians, women who wore the traditional Islamic headscarf were banned from attending public universities.
Entirely banned.
They were banned from working in government buildings and banned from becoming lawyers or teachers.
Which is an incredible form of institutional suppression.
It really was. And for the Anatolian Tigers, it was deeply insulting. You have these businessmen generating the wealth that is driving the national economy, and they are sending their daughters to university only to be told their daughters must uncover their heads or be expelled.
It just couldn't stand anymore.
Right. The new wealthy class realized that economic power meant nothing if they didn't have political and cultural power. They demanded that the state no longer treat them as an embarrassment to the Western ideal, but rather recognize them as the true, authentic core of the nation.
It's a form of societal restructuring that, well, it reminds me of, let me try this analogy out on you. It reminds me of a massive national-scale gentrification, but in reverse.
Reverse gentrification.
Yeah. Usually we think of gentrification as wealthy elites moving into a marginalized neighborhood and changing its character. But here you have a historically marginalized, underfunded population, the religious heartland, who pool capital, open businesses, generate their own massive wealth, and then use that wealth to move into the political and economic city center.
Oh, I see where you're going.
And once they take over the center, they demand different zoning laws. They change the aesthetic of the storefronts to match their own tastes. They completely remodel the national identity.
That's a highly effective way to visualize it. They moved from the geographic and economic periphery right into the halls of power in Ankara and Istanbul, and they absolutely brought their aesthetics and their historical narrative with them.
The source text paints such a vivid picture of this aesthetic synthesis in the modern Turkish city. It's not what people might assume.
What do you mean?
Well, if you walk through Istanbul today, it is not a carbon copy of a European capital like Paris, but it's also not a traditional ancient Middle Eastern bazaar. It is this intense, hyper-modern hybrid.
The visual blending must be striking.
It is, and it's deeply intentional. The new government, flush with capital from this economic boom, engaged in massive, unprecedented infrastructure projects. We are talking about gleaming high-tech modernity.
Like airports and stuff?
Yes, some of the largest new airports in the world, vast networks of high-speed rail, incredible underwater tunnels connecting the European and Asian sides of the Bosphorus. They wanted to prove they could outbuild the secular elites.
Right, we can be more modern than you.
Exactly. But interwoven seamlessly into all that hypermodernity is a very visible, very intentional resurgence of public piety.
So it's not just secular steel and glass.
Not at all. You see massive neo-Ottoman style mosques being constructed on prominent hillsides right next to those glass and steel skyscrapers. You go into a luxury high-end shopping mall in Istanbul, and you see women wearing designer Islamic fashion, carrying expensive European handbags, fully engaged in the global capitalist economy, but doing it entirely on their own religious terms.
The message is clear. You do not have to abandon your religion to be modern. You can have the high-speed rail and the mosque.
Yes. But the text notes that this physical remodeling of the country is accompanied by an even deeper, more insidious structural shift in how the nation defines its own history.
Ah, the rebranding.
The rebranding. The text highlights how education and state media have been essentially weaponized to rebrand the national narrative.
The rebranding of the historical narrative is so central to their consolidation of power because, if you want to change a nation's future, you have to rewrite its past.
You really do.
Under the old secular guard, the educational curriculum taught a very specific story. The Ottoman Empire was a period of dark, backward decline, a sick man of Europe, obsessed with religion, and Ataturk's secular republic was the glorious, modern salvation.
It was a narrative of rescue. The republic saved us from the empire.
Yes, exactly. But the new establishment is systematically flipping that narrative upside down. Through the Ministry of Education, they have vastly expanded the network of Imam Hatip schools.
I want to make sure the listener understands exactly what those are because they come up frequently in the text.
Oh, good call. So, Imam Hatip schools were originally established decades ago as vocational schools, strictly to train government-approved prayer leaders and preachers.
And they were heavily restricted by the secular military.
Heavily restricted. But the new government has aggressively expanded them, pouring billions of liras into them and transformed them into a parallel mainstream education system.
Millions of students now attend these schools.
Millions!
Yeah.
Where the curriculum heavily blends standard academics with intensive Islamic theology and Arabic language studies.
So they are cultivating a brand new generation of fiercely loyal, religiously educated citizens.
And in the standard history books, the narrative has shifted to emphasize the immense glory of the Ottoman past. They focus on the Islamic conquests, the imperial grandeur, the sheer power of the sultans.
But I'm struggling to picture how a government actually changes a national narrative in real time, beyond just swapping out textbooks. I mean, how does this reach the average person who isn't in a classroom? The source mentions television playing a huge role.
Oh, it plays a massive, perhaps the most critical role in the cultural rebranding.
Really? TV?
Yeah. If you look at state-sponsored and state-friendly television networks in Turkey over the last decade, you see the explosion of incredibly high-budget, slickly produced historical dramas.
Like soap operas.
No, more like we're talking about shows with production values that rival Hollywood epics like Game of Thrones or Vikings.
Oh, wow. And what are the shows about?
They are entirely focused on the heroic, pious founders of the Ottoman Empire, or the Seljuk Turks.
The Seljuks, just to provide context for the listener, were the medieval Turco-Persian Empire that controlled vast swaths of the Middle East and Anatolia centuries before the Ottomans, right? They were the early Islamic conquerors of the region.
Precisely. And these television shows portray these historical figures not just as kings, but as righteous, sword-wielding defenders of the Islamic faith.
Fascinating.
They are constantly shown battling corrupt Western crusaders, treacherous Byzantine empires, or internal traitors. The protagonists are always deeply pious, strong-willed leaders who refuse to bow to Western influence.
It's soft power at its absolute finest.
It is.
It's not just entertainment. It's a daily injection of political theology into millions of living rooms. They are implicitly telling the citizens, look at who you used to be. You are not the citizens of a struggling, defensive, secular fortress desperately begging to be accepted by Europe. You are the direct heirs to a glorious, unconquerable Islamic empire. You are destined to lead.
Which alters the psychological DNA of the populace. They are rebranding the nation from being the defensive rearguard of Europe to being the natural historical leader of the entire Islamic world.
Which is exactly the mechanism that connects our conversation to the global stage. Because you can't undergo a psychological shift of that magnitude in a vacuum.
No, it has to spill over.
You can't build advanced military drones, write history books featuring empire builders, watch shows about conquering the Mediterranean, and then just stay quietly within your own borders.
Right. The internal cultural earthquake inevitably crashes into their foreign policy.
It radically rewrites their foreign policy.
Yeah.
And this is where the internal battle for the Turkish soul starts causing massive diplomatic shockwaves in Washington, Brussels, and Moscow.
Because Turkey's current geopolitical strategy is a direct, unfiltered reflection of this new, confident, religious nationalism.
We are witnessing a distinct pivot toward aggressive regional leadership and a very deliberate, sometimes hostile, distancing from their traditional Western alliances.
Let's trace that pivot. Because for the entire duration of the Cold War and well into the 90s, Turkey's entire foreign policy identity was basically, we are the faithful southeastern flank of NATO. We hold the geographical line against the Soviet Union. We are good, dependable Western allies.
Under the secular generals, they were largely content to be a buffer state. Their primary goal was to integrate into the Western security architecture.
But the new establishment, fueled by the wealth of the Anatolian tigers and radicalized by this neo-Ottoman historical narrative, looks at the map of the world through completely different eyes.
They actively utilize their historical legacy as a diplomatic weapon.
The text notes that they are leaning heavily into their unique geographic position. I mean, they are the literal land bridge between Europe and the Middle East, controlling the maritime choke points between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean.
They no longer want to be viewed as the outer edge of Europe. They want to be recognized as the absolute center of their own independent sphere of influence. They believe the geography dictates destiny.
And we see this manifesting in real time. They aren't just giving speeches, they are throwing their hard military weight around. They are launching military interventions in northern Syria. They are sending troops and drones to Libya. They are heavily involved in the Caucasus, and they are aggressively disputing maritime borders with Greece in the eastern Mediterranean.
They are even setting up permanent military bases in Somalia and Qatar. I mean, they are actively intervening in complex regional conflicts that the United States and Europe are far too hesitant to touch. They are projecting power outward in a way that hasn't been seen since the collapse of the Ottoman Empire.
But this brings us to a massive, glaring contradiction. This is the geopolitical tightrope the text highlights, and I really need help unpacking this because to me, it looks like diplomatic cognitive dissonance.
It is an incredibly dangerous balancing act, for sure.
Right. Like, how can a nation simultaneously serve as a vital, functional gear in the Western NATO machine, housing critical American nuclear weapons at Incirlik Air Base, sharing high-level intelligence, operating as a core ally while its leaders openly champion a neo-Ottoman religious stream that actively distances itself from and often openly criticizes the West?
It's confusing.
Doesn't that violate basic geopolitical logic? How do you play poker at two completely different tables simultaneously?
You play at two tables by using the chips you win from the West to raise the stakes against Russia, and vice versa.
Oh, that's clever.
It creates tremendous dissonance and frustrates European and American diplomats to no end. But you have to view it from the new Turkish perspective. To them, it is not cognitive dissonance at all. It is ruthless transactionalism. It is the pursuit of absolute strategic independence.
Meaning they don't view themselves as bound by the moral or ideological framework of the NATO alliance, only the strategic convenience of it.
Exactly. The new political theology dictates that Turkey is simply too big, too historically significant, and too economically powerful to be a junior partner to Washington or Brussels.
They are their own main character.
Right. They stay in NATO because it provides a massive security umbrella, access to Western military technology, and a crucial veto power over Western security architecture. But simultaneously, they feel completely justified in purchasing advanced S-400 missile defense systems directly from Vladimir Putin's Russia.
Which drove Washington absolutely crazy, right? It led to Turkey being kicked out of the F-35 fighter jet program.
It was a massive breach of alliance protocol. Purchasing Russian radar systems while operating NATO aircraft completely compromises the security of the alliance.
So why do it?
Because the Turkish establishment calculated that their geographic leverage, their absolute control of the Bosporus Straits, which bottles up the Russian naval fleet, and their ability to control the flow of millions of Middle Eastern refugees into Europe makes them entirely indispensable to the West.
They believe they're too big to fail and too critical to abandon.
They believe they can champion a distinctively religious, independent foreign policy, stand up for Islamic causes globally, fiercely criticize Western imperialism, and still force the West to deal with them respectfully at the negotiating table. They are leveraging their geography to extract concessions from both East and West.
It is an incredibly bold, high-stakes strategy. But as the text points out, this intense diplomatic tension on the world stage is really just a macro-level reflection of the internal cultural tension we've been discussing this whole time.
Yeah, the inside reflects the outside.
The nation is trying to be two contradictory things at once: a modern, globally integrated, high-tech powerhouse, and the traditional, pious, historical leader of the Muslim world.
And the question is, can a society sustain that level of internal contradiction indefinitely?
Which brings us to the ultimate synthesis of this century-long struggle. We have traced the trauma of Ataturk's forced secularization, the rise and fall of the military Iron Guardians, the economic miracle of the Anatolian Tigers, and the aggressive neo-Ottoman foreign policy.
That's a lot of ground.
It is. But now we have to assess where this massive collision of forces actually leaves the people living there right now. The text places us directly in the landscape of the year 2026.
And what the sociological data in 2026 reveals is that the nation is still deeply, perhaps inescapably, entangled in the complex legacy of its founder.
It's kind of wild.
The text makes a rather poetic assertion here. It argues that Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, despite being dead for nearly a century, remains the most powerful man in Turkey today.
The ghost in the machine.
Precisely. The ghost has not been exorcised. His image is still ubiquitous. You cannot walk into a classroom, a government office, a post office, or look at the national currency without seeing his face.
He's everywhere.
The current religious establishment has consolidated immense power. They have changed the laws, they have purged the military, they have altered the aesthetics of the cities, and they've rewritten the history books. But they have not been able to simply erase Ataturk from the national consciousness.
They can't delete the operating system he installed. They can only try to write new code over it.
And that leads to the core debate the text introduces regarding the future. Is the secular ghost of Ataturk finally being slowly suffocated and completely overwritten by this massive neo-Ottoman religious wave? Or is a brand new, entirely unprecedented hybrid identity emerging from the wreckage of this century-long conflict?
The text argues for the latter, and the mechanism it points to is absolutely fascinating. It focuses on the youth.
Yes, the younger generation.
Because while the rest of the world watches the news and assumes they are seeing the unstoppable rising tide of Islamic populism in Turkey, the source argues the global media is completely missing the real story happening on the ground.
They are missing the pendulum swing. The text argues that secularism in Turkey didn't simply die when the military lost its veto power. It didn't disappear when the religious middle class took over the economy. Secularism evolved.
I need you to break down the mechanics of that evolution, because logically, if a society is actively promoting public piety, pouring billions into religious schools, and dominating the media with Islamic history, how does secularism survive, let alone evolve?
It evolves precisely because of that top-down pressure. You have to look at the demographics. You have an entire massive generation of young Turks in 2026 who have grown up entirely under the rule of this religiously conservative government.
Right. It's all they know.
This youth cohort has absolutely no living memory of the oppressive secularism of the 1990s. They don't remember the trauma of the headscarf brands or the military tanks rolling through the streets to suppress religious politicians.
To them, the religious establishment isn't a liberating underdog force fighting against authoritarian general.
Exactly. To the youth, the religious establishment is the authoritarian general.
No, they are the new establishment.
They are the status quo. They are the ones controlling the internet, banning protests, and dictating what can be taught in schools and what is the universal historical truth about youth.
Young people will naturally, inevitably rebel against whatever the dominant authority is.
Always. So, in a massive historical paradox, by forcing religion heavily into the public sphere, by monopolizing state media with piety, and by using the state apparatus to enforce conservative morals, the current government is actively driving a massive, quiet wave of secularization among the youth.
The data cited in the source material backs this up heavily, too. Sociological polls show a significant portion of young people, even those graduating from the religious Imam Hatip schools, are turning away from institutional religion entirely.
They are identifying increasingly as deists, believing in a creator but rejecting organized, politicized religion, or they are simply adopting secular liberal lifestyles in private defiance of the state.
The establishment tried to engineer a pious generation through top-down educational control, much like Ataturk tried to engineer a secular generation through top-down legal control.
And both attempts at social engineering seem to have generated their own exact opposite reaction.
It is the ultimate confirmation of Newton's third law applied to sociology. Every aggressive cultural action has an equal and opposite cultural reaction. Let me throw an analogy at you to see if it captures this synthesis.
Go ahead.
The legacy of Ataturk is like the concrete slab foundation of a massive house. The religious populists have come in over the last 20 years, and they've completely remodeled the exterior.
Okay, I'm with you.
They've painted the walls green, they changed the interior decor, they added Ottoman arches, they maybe even tore off the flat roof and added a massive sweeping dome. But despite all of that cosmetic and structural remodeling, the house is still undeniably sitting on that unbreakable concrete slab of secular bureaucratic statecraft that Ataturk poured a century ago.
I would take that a step further and say the foundation is not just bureaucratic, it is psychological.
How interesting.
The concept of the modern Turkish citizen, the idea of a republic with defined borders rather than an endless, expansive empire, that paradigm was permanently set by Ataturk. The religious establishment didn't dismantle the state apparatus he built. They just conquered it and tried to change its purpose.
But that concrete foundation is incredibly hard to crack.
The youth are walking on it every day, and they can feel the solidity of it beneath the newly laid carpets.
It implies that we are looking at a society locked in a state of permanent synthesis, a hybrid identity that is going to be wildly unpredictable in the coming decades because it contains the DNA of both the secular republic and the Islamic Empire simultaneously.
And that profound unpredictability has massive global implications. As the text concludes, Turkey serves as the ultimate glaring case study in the difficulty of reconciling modern, highly functioning democratic institutions with a deeply religious, historically conservative populace.
It shatters the grand theories of Western political science, doesn't it?
Completely shatters them.
For a long, long time, the West arrogantly assumed that modernization automatically, invariably meant secularization. The guiding theory of the 20th century was, as a developing country gets richer, as it integrates into global capitalism, as its citizens get smartphones, high-speed internet, and luxury shopping malls, it will naturally, quietly abandon its traditional religion and become a secular, liberal, Western-style democracy.
The end of history illusion.
FM.
Turkey proves that theory is absolutely, fundamentally false.
Turkey proves that you can have world-class infrastructure, advanced military-industrial complexes producing cutting-edge drone technology, and thriving, ruthless global capitalism, all while becoming more publicly religious, more attached to your imperial history, and more hostile to Western liberalism.
It shatters the Western monopoly on what modernity is allowed to look like.
Wow.
The Turkish model is a warning, or perhaps a highly instructive lesson, to every other developing nation in the global south and the Middle East that is currently struggling to navigate its own traditional religious identity within a hyper-globalized world.
It proves you don't have to choose between your faith and the future. You can violently, unpredictably synthesize the two.
Exactly.
Which is just a phenomenal concept to try and wrap your head around.
Okay. As we start to land the plane on this incredible historical journey, let's briefly recap the immense ground we've covered today.
We started by examining the sheer psychological trauma of the 1920s. We looked at Ataturk's mandatory operating system update, the aggressive implementation of European law, the hat law that physically interrupted prayer, and the alphabet reform that literally severed a nation's linguistic ties to its imperial past.
We analyzed how that extreme forced secularization required an equally extreme enforcement mechanism. The creation of the Iron Guardians military constitutionally mandated to act as an armed firewall against the religious traditions of their own citizens.
Then we explored the supreme irony of the 21st century. How the democratic process itself, specifically the strategic use of EU human rights mandates, became the tool used to bureaucratically strangle the generals. The failed guardrail paradox, where democratization accidentally unlocked the very religious populism it was supposed to suppress.
All of which was powered by the roaring economic engine of the Anatolian Tigers, the massive transfer of wealth to the conservative middle class, giving them the capital to demand cultural representation, alter the aesthetics of the cities, and use state media to completely rewrite the history books from a secular republic to a neo-Ottoman empire.
Leading directly into the geopolitical tightrope they walk today, leveraging their geography to play poker at two tables, balancing their NATO obligations with a fierce, independent, transactional Islamic foreign policy.
Culminating in the complex landscape of 2026, where the ghost of Ataturk continues to wrestle with the current religious establishment, driving the youth toward an entirely unpredictable, quiet secularization.
It is, without a doubt, a century of absolute cultural whiplash.
It is the ultimate story of unintended consequences.
It really is. And that brings us to our final thought. The source text leaves us with a truly profound concept, a question that builds on the mechanics of everything we've just discussed. And I want to pose this directly to you, the listener, as you go about the rest of your day.
The central mechanism we've explored today is this. Ataturk's century of forced modernization and aggressive state secularism inadvertently created the exact environment needed for the massive religious populist uprising it was designed to prevent.
The intense suppression created the explosive backlash.
Right.
So, if that historical law of physics holds true, what will the current era of forced religious rebranding via education, state media, and government power create in the next 100 years?
Is the current religious establishment, by monopolizing the state to enforce piety, unwittingly pouring the concrete for an aggressive, hyper-secular youth rebellion in the generations to come?
Are they busy creating their own ghosts? Think about that. Because as we saw at the very beginning of this deep dive, you might think you are firmly in control of the nation's destiny, but history has a very funny, very ruthless way of turning your blueprints completely upside down. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Turkish soul. We'll catch you on the next one.
Show, let's go, open up your mind and grow. Facts and stories, things glow.